I'll try this. All right. We'll see if it works or not. Okay. All right. Please excuse me. Can she hear?
I'm not sure.
Oh, okay.
She just texted me.
Okay. So the third step of this research was actually needing to find said Chinatowns. And so I did use traditional methods like newspapers, National Register listings, doctoral and master theses, but I also used some unconventional research tools like Facebook, Yelp pages. And let me just say, Yelp pages are literally one of my most favorite methods of research for this. And I know it sounds really bad, but people review everything, and this includes Chinatowns. And so whenever you read them, you would always get that really fun first-person account of how they've seen that Chinatown change throughout times. So don't sleep on Yelp. It is 100% a great tool. And another really major tool for me was actually YouTube. There is this one YouTuber called Jack Goes on a Venture, and he is going on an adventure to see every single Chinatown in the US. So his work was also very helpful in my research. And one of the things that I always like to mention is that when it comes to researching in the archives for underrepresented communities, it is not easy. Basically, sometimes archives, they just don't have this material, either because they purposely decided to exclude the community from being preserved, they don't have anyone donating any of the materials to them, or just because they didn't have the time and resources to actually collect this type of material. So you do have to go outside of like traditional research methods in order to find this type of information. And so another thing that I also wanted to point out is that I record every single keyword that I use whenever I do this type of research, because for me, it's very important to see how are we tagging this data, and are there better ways to tag this data so that other researchers are able to find what they need. So you guys should also do that, very helpful. And another thing is that sometimes instead of using the word Chinatown, I did use terms like Asia District, Asia Town, and International District, because some communities prefer using these terms, or they incorporated their Chinatown into like an international district to honor all the different ethnicities that currently exist there. Great. And so my fourth step was, after I found all of my Chinatowns, which was 83, I decided to map them. And then I mapped them to their absolute most possible historic boundaries. And after I did that, then I actually did an overlay to find any National Register historic district that it could have been included part of. And I'm going to go more into depth as to why I did this. So this is just what I did. So what were my limitations? Firstly, I only had 9 weeks to do this. So 9 weeks is 100% not enough time to do this type of research. So you can see this research as like preliminary data for bigger steps that I will take in the future. And the biggest problem I had was COVID-19, because sometimes I couldn't get an appointment with the archives because they required 1 or 2 weeks in advance for an appointment, and then they suddenly closed down because someone caught COVID. The other issue that stems from COVID-19 is having to depend on online resources that I couldn't verify because, one, there was sometimes a paywall. Two, I just couldn't find where they were backing up their data. So that was one issue that I had. Another issue that I had was the way the National Register lists and categorizes their data is not very up to date. And so I could not really rely on them for like some of the things that I was doing. But by far, the biggest problem with my data is that I did not conduct enough interviews with Chinatown leaders and preservation organizations. Anything you read online may not be the actual reality of what it is on the streets. You actually have to talk to the people who face this reality every single day in order to have a better understanding of the issues that they have. And so those are my limitations. So here is a very brief history of Chinatown. So Chinatowns really began when gold is discovered in Northern California in 1848. Around the same time, the Taiping Revolution and the Opium Wars were also occurring in China, which caused class instability, economic instability, and political instability. So a lot of people were trying to leave China in order to better their economic situations and for their family. And a majority of these Chinese laborers came from a small district called Taishan, which is located in southern eastern China, which is where my family is from. And they faced a lot of discrimination when they came here because they were seen as unwanted foreign competition. And this again continues on with the Transcontinental Railroad when they're recruiting for more employees to work on the railroad. And so Chinese laborers, for example, like a type of discrimination they face would be forced to do like lighting up the dynamite for like the mountains in order to make that pathway for them to build the tracks. And that is very dangerous work. So they were made to do a lot of dangerous work that resulted in hundreds of lives being lost. And so after the Transcontinental Railroad had been completed, there was actually a small depression, which made finding jobs even harder. And so the discrimination against Asian Chinese laborers was even worse. And so they had to find employment in other places like agriculture, fishing, and logging. And there's also a trend where Chinese laborers actually began to move eastward in order to get away from all of that discrimination that was happening in the West Coast. So you see them going into larger urban centers and places like Baltimore City. And so very early Chinatowns had really formed as an economic and social network for Chinese laborers to be protected from that discrimination that they were facing. And another contributor for the way Chinatowns forms are alien land laws, which prevented not just Chinese laborers, but also like immigrants from being able to own property. So they were only able to lease in places which may not have been the greatest places. And so that's how you get these legal and social little ethnic enclaves of a Chinatown being developed. So I'm not going to go through all of this, but there is a lot of legislation that impact the way Chinatown communities have both formed and declined. But the biggest one I think a lot of people here might be familiar with is the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which was the first time a racial group was barred from entering the United States. The only way that you could actually enter as a Chinese person was either if you were a diplomat or if you were a student. And so this act gets extended multiple times up until 1943, when it's finally ended because China is seen as an ally to the United States. But even then, it didn't matter because in 1924, there was an immigration law that gave preferences for European countries. And so that quota system was still in place. It was like only 100 Chinese people could enter the US per year. And then there's also the 1960 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which I will go through a little bit later. So one thing that I noticed when I was doing this research was that a lot of those historic Chinatowns, they don't exist anymore, or they're for the ones that do exist, they're facing some kind of decline. And it's like a really multitude of reasons. It's the lack of affordable housing, the desire for better education. Politics is a huge thing. And sometimes it's just natural migration that people just no longer want to live in a Chinatown, so they just move out. And I, as a person who is in urban planning, I actually really feel like a part of the reason is due to that disconnect that we have between preservation and urban planning practice. And one such example would be urban renewal. I know historic preservation doesn't exist until like the 1960s when the National Historic Preservation Act is, but this is just one example of when you allow urban planners to go crazy and then they decide to raise everything that doesn't please them. And this includes Chinatowns, which were seen as basically slums. And so one example would be Baltimore City's Chinatown. And so here is a little article right here that talks about how the urban renewal projects of Baltimore City had forced a woman to close down her Chinese laundry. And she talks about how she worked really hard to get here and all of it's gone just because they think that area of Chinatown needs to be redeveloped. And this is actually what Baltimore's Chinatown looks like today. There's only about like two to three businesses that still exist right here. And so past all of that, historic preservation is usually seen as a very regulatory role in the urban planning process, as in they only see historic preservationists really being responsible for reviewing permits and that's basically it. And sometimes like giving some history about an area that they're going to do planning in. And that is a little bit problematic because preservationists aren't able to like fully explain or give their input as to why certain places need preservation. And so like that disconnect is very problematic. And so another big factors as to why Chinatowns are declining is the 1960s Civil Rights Act. And there's like a bunch of acts in this, but the major ones are the fact that you can't discriminate based on housing and based on jobs, which basically means that people can get jobs and housing wherever they want to now. And if you combine this with the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which lifted those racial quotas and allowed everyone to come over to the United States, you see a huge change occurring in Chinatowns. The first one is that some traditional Chinatowns, they have people leaving them because now people can live wherever they want to. For the newcomers that come into the United States, they no longer have to depend on Chinatown as a stepping stone into American society because legally they are now allowed to go anywhere that they want. And so some Chinatowns face a decline because people are just leaving now, but some are revitalized, so it's not that bad. Okay, so what were my research results? I'm going to first talk about the different Chinatown types that I found, but I want to give a shout out to these researchers because they played a very strong role in the way that I was able to categorize Chinatowns. Because the literature, whenever it comes to Chinatowns, they only ever talk about the East and West Coast. They never really talk about like all the Chinatowns are in the middle of the United States. And so Arnson and Kent were two researchers who were researching on Cleveland's Chinatown, and they noticed this gap. And so they made their own categorization method, which was super helpful. And I could definitely see how they did it. After I like did my own research, I see where they got their categorization, but they wrote it nicer than I did. The second person that was pivotal in the way I categorized Chinatown was Dr. Wei Li. And basically, she is the very first person that writes about ethnoburbs. And an ethnoburb is basically an ethnic settlement in the suburbs. And she's the very first person to ever talk about it. And so her work was also influential in what I was doing. So the very first Chinatown type is a traditional Chinatown that forms before World War II, and it's mostly made up of male bachelors because the early Chinese laborers that came in, they were mostly guys. And so I don't have a picture of one because a majority of them are already gone. So, but this one here is the Chinatown, is the Sun Mercantile building that's located in Phoenix, Arizona. And they actually have two Chinatowns. The first one was forcibly moved into the second location, which is where this building is. And they don't really have a Chinatown anymore. It really faced a huge decline after World War II. The second type, one that I feel like maybe most people might be familiar with, are revitalized Chinatowns. And basically, these are traditional Chinatowns that were revitalized when new residents start to move in because restrictive legislation was lifted. And they're a lot more family oriented because people are bringing in their families, they're starting families. And one example would be Manhattan's Chinatown. And this is what it looks like. The third type is personally my favorite type because it's just cool. It's a commercial Chinatown, and there are actually two types of commercial Chinatowns. So the very first type is when a Chinese business person decides to move into an area where there's absolutely no other Chinese businesses to compete with, but then other people and other businesses start to follow them. And so that's one way it forms. The second one is when investors decide to commercialize on the Chinatown name. And so you have like strip malls with like the Chinatown name. Like this one is located in Georgia and it's considered Georgia's Chinatown, but it's really just a bunch, it's just capitalizing on the name basically, but there are Chinese businesses there. And this second example is my favorite example because I was just surprised. North Miami decided that they would make a Chinatown Cultural Arts and Innovation District in like 2016, but they don't really have a large Chinese population. And when you read through their plans are really dependent on using like Chinese foreign investors to make this Chinatown happen. So their plans are on on hold right now because of COVID, but it's just very interesting. And the fourth type is a satellite Chinatown. So they're just Chinatowns that form outside of traditional Chinatown spaces. So it's basically an ethnoburb would be an example. And this one here is Rockville, Maryland, which is where I'm from. And I took these pictures myself. And then the second type would be like Flushing's Chinatown area. So I would like to say satellite Chinatowns usually are formed of several different strip malls. So that's how you can usually tell it's a satellite Chinatown. So after I did all that, I decided to map them in their categories. And so you can see that a lot of the traditional Chinatowns were located on the West Coast and also in the middle. And on the East Coast, you also see that there are several Chinatowns as well. So it's a cool map. And so what does Chinatowns look like when we talk about national historic preservation? And Chinatowns are not really talked about individually. They're usually incorporated in larger Asian American and Pacific Islander initiatives. And one example would be like the Asian American Pacific Islander National Historic Landmarks Theme Study that was released by the National Park Service. Like Chinatowns aren't talked about specifically, but it's within that like initiative. And so I also recommend people should read this if you guys are ever bored. This was actually what jump-started my understanding of Asian American historic preservation work. Really great read. But yeah, so nationally, we don't really talk about Chinatowns individually. And so, like I said, in my like step 4 of my research method, I wanted to see how were Chinatowns being preserved on a national level. And that meant for me looking at the National Register of Historic Places. And I chose to do historic districts instead of individual buildings because one, I didn't have enough time to individually look for all the buildings. And number 2, because historic districts are larger. And in my thinking, Chinatowns were large. It's not just condensed to one building, it's several buildings. So a historic district made more sense in my head. And so when I had all of those 83 Chinatowns, and after I mapped all their possible historic districts, I went through the National Register and looked through every single historic district that was within the boundaries of a historic Chinatown. And I pulled out every single one that had a historic district that was related to a Chinatown, and there was 19 in total. So out of those 19 Chinatown related historic districts, only 8 of them were specifically a historic district made for a Chinatown, and 11 of them were considered Chinatown related because they had at least one sentence that mentioned their Chinatown. So like they acknowledged that there was a Chinatown. Like one of them literally said in a single sentence, there was a Chinatown here. Like that was it. Or another one I remember reading said there were 2,000 Chinese people living here, and 2,000 is a really big number. And so after I did that, it became very clear that on a national level, we are not preserving a lot of Chinatowns because 19 out of 83 is a very small number. And when I was looking at the way that the National Register was tagging their data for like areas of significance, out of those 19, 16 of them were tagged for architecture, 10 for Asian, 11 for commerce, and 10 for social history. And basically what this tells me is that if you didn't do all that background research of like looking for those historic district boundaries, you would have missed a lot of this information. Like we need to change the way that we tag our data so that way people are able to find and utilize it for their own personal research. And yeah. So this is what it looks like when you map these 19 Chinatowns. And for those that are wondering what this yellow one is, it's an archaeological site. It's for Riverside's Chinatown. So some important key notes is that although these Chinatowns not all the Chinatowns are on the National Register, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. Underrepresented communities have always made their own repositories, their own archives and methods of preservation, whether it's having their own personal oral history projects, mapping projects, or community organizations that are dedicated to preserving whatever memory is left or what memory is still there. And so those Chinatowns are still remembered. And so as historic preservationists, it's really important that we provide resources if they want them for them to utilize to protect their own Chinatowns. And so how do we help to preserve Chinatowns? I'm going to go over like 4 tools. It's not going to be super in depth, but the first tool is property designation. It's when you designate a property into some kind of listing, whether it's local, state, or national. And there are a lot of benefits for this, particularly if you designate the property on a local register, because we have development review boards. And so it's a form of protection from any developmental pressures, because some developers, they don't like to touch anything that is designated as a historic property. Others do, but so it's just that one type of form of protection in case they're feeling pressured to be demolished. The second benefit are historic tax credits. So if there is a particular building that needs rehab or the community wants to readapt it and they're on a register, they can apply for historic tax credits if they're available on the state or local level. You do need, in order to take advantage of the federal historic tax credit, you do need to be on the national register listing though. And another reason why property designation is so important is because it builds that awareness and lets the community know that we acknowledge that you have a piece of history that exists and that we want to help preserve it by making it onto this list. And so one example of how property designation helps would be the Shelley School Apartments. Basically, they combine the historic tax credits with low income tax credits, and now this building is being reused as an affordable housing complex. The second tool, which is my favorite, are economic development programs. And simply because I always think that historic preservation and economic development, they always go hand in hand together, because we're all about preserving businesses that are there and the people that are also there. And so one case study example would be San Francisco's Legacy Business Program, which is basically a grant program. So if you are listed as a legacy business program, meaning that you have contributed to the culture and heritage of that community, you can be on this listing, and that makes you eligible for a grant. So how it works is that if you're on the listing, then your landlord can get a grant if they provide you like a 10-year or a long-term lease. What this is supposed to do is help you fight against those rising rents that like kick you out of your place. And so that's one way that it helps. The second case study is the Little Tokyo Community Investment Fund. This one is a little relatively new, but basically this one runs on the idea of community land trust. So their goal is actually to buy up all the property in which Little Tokyo sits on, in order to, one, protect the buildings from being demolished and like being bought up by a really unscrupulous developer. And the second is to also keep the rents low, because if they own the buildings, and they can keep the rent at an affordable rate and keep those important businesses staying in the area. So the third tool, which is my personal favorite as well, is the historic context studies. And basically, there are studies that provide context in helping to evaluate historic resources and guide surveys. And so the way that we conduct a historic context study can be super, super great for local communities, because you give them that opportunity to write their own history, to determine what buildings and what stories that they want to tell in these hold up. So historic context studies are important because when you allow the community to write their own story and determine what buildings are of importance to them, it enables whoever is using these for like planning purposes to understand the underlying value of the built landscape. And so like one example that I can give you guys is, let's say there is an ordinary looking grocery store and it looks run down, and you think, great, let's tear it down. But then if you do that history, you do that outreach, talking with a community member, you might find out that grocery store is the oldest like Chinese grocery store in the entire area, the very first one that opened up there. And so like that's one way that you can use a historic context study to find out how important that built environment is. They're also really great tools for public and educational use, and they're definitely used within urban planning departments to guide future developments and decisions. One example would be Survey LA, which was an 8-year historic context study, and they're planning to use and integrate their historic context study within the planning department. I'm not sure how. So the last tool would be reinterpretation, which is basically addressing all of those harmful narratives that we have that surround like the Asian American community and reduce those biases. One of them being the model minority myth, that all Asian Americans are doing really great, they're ahead of everyone, and they don't need any help. That's absolutely not true, and it's very harmful when you stereotype a group like that. So reinterpretation would help to reduce those like wrong thinking, to help the community build their identity and help them become more united, because they would have that, they would be in that process of reinterpreting certain places. And so one case study example is actually the National Trust's SHINE program, which I think they just started this year. But basically, it's a program that looks at all the African American enslaved sites that they have under their stewardship, and they're looking at the way that they've been interpreting these sites. And a lot of times, these enslaved sites are usually focused on like not the enslaved person's perspective, but like the people who had owned the property. So their goal is to change that, to actually look and interpret these properties based on the enslaved person's experience in order to not erase it and make them the primary person in the narrative. Yes. All right, so what now after talking about all those tools, and are like people actually doing it? And the answer is yes. It is a great time to be a preservationist if you're interested in like Asian Americans preservation. So I can speak for the DMV area. These are a couple of the things that are happening right now that I'm actually a part of. The first one is that the state of Maryland is actually conducting a historic context study on AAPI communities. They just started that last year, and I think they got their grant 2 years ago to do this project. The second place would be Montgomery County, which is where I'm from, and they too are also doing an AAPI historic context study for the area of Montgomery County. And then DC, the heart of the United States, is also doing a historic context study for AAPI communities. And so this work is very alive, very thriving, and I see a lot of potential in it. So like, I honestly see this work as being incorporated within all of these, that I'm a volunteer in all of them. So yeah, it's going great. Yeah, that was it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. What a great subject. Questions for Karen here?
So while you were using Yelp and everything, did you uncover any discrimination or like outright hate against these communities that they were reviewing?
I'll be honest, Yelp has a really great system of reporting these, so I didn't see any.
Okay.
Emma?
So as a graduate student working on this research, where do you kind of see it, what's the word I'm looking for? How do you see it integrating into your future career? Like, what would you like to do down the road in your professional career with this research?
So my goal in life is to become a preservation planner. So that would definitely impact, I want to be a preservation planner in places where there is a Chinatown. Because when I was looking through a lot of like urban plans that are made for these areas, they usually focus on like the commercialization of that area. And so as an urban planner, I could change that. So that's my goal.
Or you can go first.
You mentioned that in your section on lifetime sounds of experience, a lot of affordable housing and politics, and I wasn't sure what you meant exactly by that.
So it's again tied into urban planning when I say the lack of affordable housing. So one example would be Manhattan's Chinatown. They have so much development for luxury condos, which people cannot afford. And so that's why some Chinatowns are declining. Politics play a role, but what I mean by politics is that some politicians are just not interested in preserving any Chinatowns, or they secretly, deeply inside have been paid off by developers to approve projects to raise down the Chinatown, basically. Yes.
Although I'm not a historic preservation major, I'm really interested in like Asian cities as a minor. So like I've been, as someone who's Vietnamese, I've also experienced some of that like Asian town sort of topic. There's actually an Asian town in Nova. I think it's in Falls Church called the City Center, and I'm assuming that could be categorized as I think it's a satellite town. Not so sure though, because it's just that we don't have an official full Saigon in Nova, although we have a bunch of Vietnamese people there. So like, this really helped me a lot.
That's good. There's actually a bunch of terms for like little ethnic Asian American communities. Like there's a little Cambodia in Los Angeles. Little Saigon is a legit term that they do use for different areas. There's also Manila Town that they're also using, Filipino Town as well, and there's a lot of different terms. Yeah. Yes.
Would you know if at all, have Chinatowns been affected by the more recent tensions between China and the United States over the past couple of years, or?
I have no idea.
Sorry.
I have a question. When you describe those 4 categories that were informed by various scholarly studies you looked at, you said that the third one was your favorite.
Yes, the commercial.
Yeah, can you explain why you have this affinity for it?
Oh, I really like economics. So the fact that like you try to start your business where there's no competition, but now you have competition, that's pretty funny to me. So
Okay.
that's one reason why. And it's also just about how much like there's hatred toward like Asian American communities, but you're willing to capitalize on their name is something that like does fascinate me as a person. And additionally, this isn't just for Chinatown communities. The way that I found out about that type of category was because it also applies to Koreatowns. There was a study that was done by this woman that I don't remember her name, but she was talking about how Korean international businesses have realized that America loves like Korean things, and so they are buying up property in order to make Koreatowns in the same way that a commercial Chinatown is being built. Yeah.
On one of your maps, I noticed that you had a Chinatown in Hawaii. Do you have any more information on that?
Yes, it's Honolulu's Chinatown.
Oh,
Yeah,
awesome.
I went there and it's still hanging on. It's not as beautiful or amazing or revitalized as it was before, but there are some efforts right now.
You know, as you were talking, I was thinking about cultural